Hi, my name is Martin Grazer. I was born in 1934. Of course, that makes me a little older than I look, I hope. And I have a story to tell about mental illness that affected my life, my whole life, changed it somewhat for the better at times. My father was a pharmacist. He graduated from Temple University, and this is in the 30s, with honors. They had a business. My grandmother, who was a businesswoman, gave my mother and my father money to open up a pharmacy back in the 30s. Anyway, unfortunately, he developed a mental illness. And of course, back in those days, mental illness was something that was a no-no. I was 5 at the time, and my brother was 3, and my sister 6. So it was pretty rough having this afflict our family, and my mother having to take care of everything. The business had to close because my father got to the point where he just couldn't operate as a pharmacist. I remember wanting to run away at the time because I was afraid, and it was just bad. The environment was very bad. Also, my mother, who had a lot of problems under the circumstances, was not very loving toward me. She had her own problems to deal with, and apparently I was there, but I was not shown the affection or the care that maybe I wanted at the time. So I was pretty much on my own. Then we ran into a conflict with the family. Having mental illness, my mother's mother, who also was not a very affectionate person, we were always told, and I remember as children, that you're going to develop a sickness like your father. Whenever my grandmother would fight with my mother, this is the first thing that would come out of her mouth, that we would develop what my father had. And in those days, they didn't understand mental illness was a sin. It was a cross to bear. Okay, so I lived with that fear most of my young life. In fact, for a long time, I lived with that fear of becoming mentally ill, or if I get married and have children, they're going to develop the same illness. So you could say that I was raised in a dysfunctional family. Nobody's fault, but this is life. Eventually, my father was put in the Byberry, a state hospital, which doesn't exist today, but he was in his 30s when his family took over and put my father in Byberry, committed him, and my mother's mother, who had a business and was well off, said, well, she'll take care of her daughter and her children, which we were, her grandchildren. So we lived, we only had the basic necessities in growing up. On one side was wealth that my grandmother accumulated from running a business, and the other side was us going to school, wearing hand-me-downs from my uncles, putting cardboard in our shoes when we would get a hole in them because we couldn't afford to go out and buy shoes. And my grandmother was quite stingy in her allowance. So we lived a life where we looked for other people to help us. Okay. But I managed to survive. I went to college in the evening, the Wharton School. I studied accountancy. I graduated. Then I went into the service. I was an MP, stationed in Europe for 2 years, stationed in Germany, enjoyed it immensely, came out feeling really good about myself. Thereafter, I met my wife, Harriet, and married her, 32 years. Had a very happy marriage with my wife. Unfortunately, she had developed multiple sclerosis, but it wasn't as serious, luckily, at the time. So they described it as being benign. So we lived a fairly good life with her MS until she, in her late 50s, when it really got bad. I owe my wife an awful lot in developing. When it came to my father, this fear was in my life forever, so to speak. And I would discuss this with my wife, and I'll never forget what she said to me. And we weren't married yet. She said, Marty, your father isn't a criminal. He didn't commit a crime. He didn't hurt anybody. He's just sick. You should get to know him. And because of those words, and I'll never forget it, she said, you know where he is. Let's go visit him. Well, he was still in Byberry at the time. And believe it or not, got in the car with my daughter, We went to Byberry, and I had my first look at my father after something like 30-some years. And of course, he didn't know me, and I really didn't know him, but it was a revelation in the fact that this is my father. And at last, I could talk to him, even though he really didn't respond to me, but I was there, he was there, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Eventually, he was released from Byberry. They closed Byberry down, and he was put in the city, in Center City. And my wife and my daughter and myself would go visit him and take him out for dinner, and he loved to eat hot dogs. We took him to Levis's, and he just enjoyed it immensely. But he never fully realized that I was his son, or that he thought his children were still children. So anyway, that helped me tremendously. I have a lot to be thankful for, and all I can say is knowing that mental illness, especially today, isn't a sin. It can be helped. You can possibly be cured. But I learned a great lesson, and I'll never forget my wife for bringing me around to knowing and at least seeing my father.